Welcome to Over the Mountain. You're here today with Uriel, otherwise known as Freak Daddy, who's a musician and performance artist that I met at Glitch at Chateau de Fay not so long ago. And I'm so happy to have you today because the topic of transgender has been so close to my heart, and meeting you has been wonderful. So welcome to Over the Mountains. Yes,
Thanks.
anything you'd like to say to our listeners?
Yeah, I'm just so happy to be here and happy to have this conversation. It was great to I remember when you walked into the chateau, and I was just, I don't know, instantly just really curious about who you were. And then when I got to read your manifesto that you wrote, it just really struck me, and I loved being able to kind of see my thoughts on paper coming out of someone else's mouth. So it was really nice to connect with you then, and I really enjoyed our chats walking around the grounds there, which were beautiful and incredible. And what a cool place and what a cool experience we both got to have. And I'm grateful that we managed to, stay connected after that.
Yes. So I really wanted to invite you over our podcast called Over the Mountains. And the whole idea of it is that, well, there's somewhere where there's maybe a second renaissance, a rebirth for humanity. And we can't really take shortcuts to get there. And I feel for me, one of the key thing is to be able to have difficult conversation about sensitive topics, such as the topics around identity, gender, and it takes real wisdom to be able to talk about these things. And what I found amazing in my conversation with you is the grace, the clarity, and the personal sharing, and your openness and vulnerability to share about this topic. And it's been something I wanted to talk about publicly. And therefore, I was so happy to meet you, because I think it's desperately needed. There's many people who'd like to talk about it, but in a way that is also open, loving, and full of understanding and wanting to exchange.
Yeah, absolutely. I think this is what we were discussing, when we first met and we're walking around under those 400-year-old trees, just how important it is for people to have the space to ask the questions, and to have good faith, which is somehow, sometimes just not always available. Because there's lots of really, hurtful things that can exist in these conversations, or times in which people just don't yeah, it's hard on both sides, right? I think you and I were actually discussing this the other day as we were preparing for this podcast, that you have folks that are experiencing real systemic um issues and violence, and so it can be difficult sometimes to discuss and to have the grace to discuss the nuance of experience, when you're actively being oppressed. And that goes for anyone who experiences any sort of systemic oppression, but specifically with the trans community, I think that it can be such a misunderstood experience, and then such a hot button kind of experience, that it can just become very exhausting to try and explain. And because transness and gender identity really affects everyone, because it's a part of all of us, and it's something that we all kind of reckon with, it can be very triggering to cisgendered people who have these conversations, and maybe something in even their line of questioning can bring something up within them that they weren't ready to face, that they weren't ready to kind of deal with. Um, and so, like I said, kind of on both sides, it can be triggering. So it's understandable that it's difficult to have these conversations, but really necessary, I think, to come to the table now, especially with how everything has kind of progressed over the last few years, and especially recently, and especially where I'm from in America. I think it's more important than ever to create these spaces to have deep, honest, and good faith conversations, and to be able to ask those questions. So I'm grateful that
Yeah.
you provided this space, and I'm happy to be here and honored to be able to have some conversations with you.
Thank you. Yes.
So, Uriel, I actually really wanted to start by you telling us a little bit about your background. Like, where? where were you born? What was growing up for you like?
Yeah, so I was born in Columbus, Ohio, actually in the States. And then pretty soon after I was born, about 5 years later, I moved to Birmingham, Alabama, with my family. And then I lived in the South uh, uh, basically until I was 30. I moved to Nashville, Tennessee when I was about 15, and then ended up moving to the West Coast at 30, and then lived in California for a while. I was raised in a Southern evangelical Christian home, and went primarily to Christian schools, so was really indoctrinated into American, Christian evangelical beliefs and ideologies. And I no longer practice the faith and am consider myself deconverted. Um, and a lot of my art and a lot of the work that I do is around spirituality and kind of re-accessing my own spirituality through processing the trauma that I experienced by being indoctrinated into that belief system, which is really harsh and very um, oppressive to queer and trans people in general. So a lot of my work kind of unpacks is part of my own process of unpacking my experiences in evangelical church. Yeah.
And can you tell me, like, so your parents were Christian, like, were you, when did you start feeling that maybe you were not in the right body, or like, were you also, just so for a bit of context, when you were born, you were born, like, biologically, you were born female, is that
Mhm.
right?
That's correct. Yeah.
And so what was your relationship to your parents, with like first to yourself and with your family? What was that like? How did that whole process started for you from your
Mhm.
childhood to when you transition?
So yeah, I mean, I'll just say for the disclaimer that every trans person's experience is different, and I think that and mine is no exception. Mine is definitely different and unique, but not necessarily in the grand scheme of things. I think there's a lot of people that have experienced similar things to me, but because I was raised in the type of environment I was raised in, I was very sheltered with the things that I was allowed to consume from media and, just in general. And I subsequently had very little access to queerness, to an understanding of queerness, and to an understanding of trans identity at all. So it's hard to say how I may have identified differently had I had access and understanding of the full spectrum of human experience, what I would have kind of identified as or existed as. Um, but I didn't have that language. So I
Mm.
didn't actually start transitioning or even accepting my not like gender non-conforming, uh identity, I guess, until about 2018, I want to say. 2018 was around when I started experiencing that, and I initially came out as non-binary. I understood that gender for me was something that was always difficult, um, but it wasn't something that I really fully understood. And I think one of the hardest things that I think plagues all trans people is our own internalized transphobia, and especially if we've been raised in environments that are hostile towards transness in general. It can be really hard to reconcile with your own dysphoria and even identify that you are dysphoric in the first place. Um, so yeah, so I think like I started to unpack my gender identity in 2018, came out as non-binary to begin with, but then slowly but surely continued to kind of, admit to myself and the people around me what had been true all along, and that, when I look at my life and look back on things, there are some moments that I kind of can point to and say, oh, well, here was some evidence and those types of things. But I don't necessarily love kind of doing that or having to kind of, not that I'm not, I'm absolutely down to continue to talk about it. don't mishear me, but I just mean kind of in general. I think that it starts to get sort of uh unnecessary to kind of like point back to sort of like, oh, and this is how we kind of prove that, you're a trans person, is because you had this experience at this time, because everything
Yeah.
really, really different.
Thank Thank you for expressing these things. And first, I also really want to acknowledge like the gratitude I have for you to talk so openly about your experience and your path. And in a way, yeah, it's very powerful that you bring yourself so fully. And I'm kind of asking question in a very maybe innocent and naive way, and never wanting to ask this question in order to offend or cause upset, but just really to understand. Like,
Sure.
because it's such a different world for me. Like maybe like I would be called a cis woman. I'm a cis woman. I'm actually very happy in my body, and it's like I have a family member who is queer, but I'm not, I'm
Right.
this is not my experience. And so it's more trying to like I'm asking these questions to really kind of like, oh, let me really understand so that
Yeah.
uh because if like in the world we need to know understand each other to live together. And you can't love someone if you don't understand them.
Absolutely.
So it really comes from that. Can you say a little bit, you said in 2018
Uh-huh.
you started to identify with like non-binary, like what, like in a way I think many people are quite interested in origin stories of like, okay, where does that, because it's something human beings, we love story and it helps us
Sure.
understand ourselves through others. Like I think it would be super helpful to understand a little bit more into details of like what may, like you said, there were maybe some incident earlier in your childhood or at earlier point that were maybe more significant than one might realize at the time. Can you tell us a little bit more?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think I, you know, I have to look back and unpack my life, and I still am, because that's been my experience. Some trans people, have like an inherent knowing when they're younger, or have access to that language. I think, like I was saying earlier, maybe if I had had more access to that, the trans mask or trans male identity, maybe I would have been able to articulate myself a little bit better. Who knows? But I always felt really uncomfortable with the performance of femininity. It never really felt like it fit me, and it always felt like a struggle, and it was really exhausting to me, the whole process. And not that femininity has to be expressed in one way or the other, but the type of femininity that was sold to me, at least initially, was, you know, makeup every day, high heel shoes, dresses, very just kind of stereotypical femininity, which I think I was really resistant against. And then as I got older and got to kind of get out of these, misogynistic and really patriarchal sort of circumstances with my own father and, other people in these like really traditional Southern kind of communities, then I started kind of exploring myself more, and I was like, well, maybe my femininity is kind of hiding in, some other expression of femininity, right? Because femininity is such a wide-ranging thing. Maybe the issue is that I just didn't really want to be that type, of woman, or identify in that way, or like dress myself in that way. Maybe that was the restriction. But then even so, it was like I never really felt comfortable. The performance of femininity really just kind of felt I don't know, like an ill-fitting sweater. I would describe, once I got like older, one of my friends asked me, like, and I started, once I understood that non-binary was an option for me, then I was like, that actually feels more aligned, right? This sort of like, let me just get rid of gender altogether. And when people started asking me questions like you are now, when my friends were asking me questions like, well, why, what is non-binary? Like, why are you identifying that way? And I would at the time just kind of be like, well, and I've gone through different variations and experiences with like spirituality and what I think about reincarnation and those types of things. So I said,
Why
yeah. Go
Can
ahead.
I say what I would just hear, what I think is fascinating is for you guys, you're both going through a process of figuring out yourself. And at the same time, you have to explain to others and others in your environment. And that must be quite difficult of both
Oh, it's
like,
extremely difficult.
well, I am still trying to figure it out. And then I have to answer your questioning, but I'm still going through this figuring out myself. So I might not have
Yeah.
such clear answer yet. So can you say a bit more? What was your answer or this process?
Yeah, my answer, yeah, thank you for noting that. My answer to my friend at the time, to him, was I feel like like I said, at the time I had a different kind of spiritual understanding, but I was like, I feel like in past lives I was a man, and this time I came to Earth and I decided to be a woman, and that I am like a man inside a woman's body, and it's like I'm in drag that I can never take off. And at the time, that's how I kind of reconciled it. And also kind of talking to, like, looking at past things, one thing that would happen to me too was it wasn't just, that the performance of a certain type of femininity was felt oppressive to me, although it did. It was also that I noticed that when I would get into relationships and romantic relationships, mostly with men, I would have these really, like, painful points where I felt like I had to kind of confess to them an aspect of myself. And one of those things was that I was like, hey, sometimes I just have like boy days. And at the time, I thought that it was just like, I just really hate performing femininity. And so sometimes I just like really want to, wear a baseball cap and not have to perform this femininity, which was true. But I had a partner eventually at one point say, I really don't like your boy days. And I'm like, why? I'm like, why? Because in my mind, I was even rationalizing it as like, it's just a day I gave myself permission not to perform high femininity, which to me, when I say high femininity or high femme in the queer community, is like the lipstick and the nails and the hair and the whatever. Like, in my mind, I was like, I'm just giving myself a day off from having to perform
Mm.
that because I thought I had to, which is my own, like I said, indoctrination where I grew up. But that was my understanding. And so I just was seeing it as like, I'm just asking these men to still love me even if I'm not performing high femininity. But this partner in particular was like, I don't really like your boy days. And at first I was offended because I was like, what, you just expect me to, be this like version of femininity all the time? And he was like, no, he's like, your personality changes. And not like full personality change, but like your demeanor changes. The way that you interact with me changes. You sit differently, you talk differently, you exist differently. And at the
Wow.
time, that was really kind of destabilizing for me, and I felt really like, "Oh my gosh, is there something wrong with me? Do I have some type of undiagnosed mental illness? Like, what is going on? Why am I this way?" And so I think, like, there was just this deep, deep, deep discomfort, which, is another way of describing my own dysphoria, that didn't really that has really only become like apparent in a way that I can talk about it retrospectively now that I've been transitioning for about 5 years. Because, like you said, as you're in the midst of figuring it out, it's very difficult to experience it, be digesting it, trying to deconstruct the things in your, mind and heart to figure out what it is you need, and then to simultaneously express that out into the world. It's not an easy
Yeah.
process.
Can I ask you more a very naive question of like,
Sure.
okay, but one thing is like you could be like, for example, you could be a lesbian woman who's not feminine at all, very like,
Sure.
buff and like wearing and so like, yeah, like in a way, I'm like, okay, like you're having your boy days,
Hmm.
like, yeah, I don't exactly almost know my question, but it's almost like, oh. Because transitioning also physically, it's not just like, you had also a surgery,
Yep.
like you took hormones, you went quite into your journey to transition.
Hmm.
And it's almost, I'm sensing that it could be a spectrum in this transitioning. One spectrum would be to not operate and just be more masculine,
Sure.
but there's a choice in the transit. Can you tell me a little bit more how that unpacked for you?
Yeah. I mean, it took time. It took time for me to figure out, to continue to ask myself what I needed, which, uh, not surprisingly, my transition and my choice to medically transition is deeply and intrinsically tied to my desire to dig myself out of my own CPTSD, and specifically the ways in which I had coped through hating my own body and being in sort of um, in opposition to my inner self, constantly talking down to myself, being really self-critical, and yeah, just having a hostile internal environment that I eventually, right around, like I said, around 2016, 2017, started to work through and started to realize, like, I was dealing with suicidal ideation and really, I mean, I still do, but I was dealing with suicidal ideation and was just really getting, I kind of reached this breaking point with that where I was like, okay, I've been hating myself for so long. I might as well try loving myself because what do I have to lose? You know, I might as well try to do this in a different way. And so once I started doing that process of trying to retrain my brain to be kind to itself, that's when it started to kind of unlock, like, okay, well, how deep am I willing to go in my expression of self-love? And for me in my life, that was parallel to me slowly over time kind of understanding, like, okay, well, like you just said, am I comfortable just not wearing makeup? Is that what I need to do? And it's like, oh, well, that's still not quite enough. Okay, well, what if I start dating women and then I just, I'm not even performing for the male gaze anymore. What does that mean? Okay, well, that's still not quite enough. Well, what if I, completely deconstruct my understanding of patriarchy and what it means to be a woman, and then I just exist kind of freely and whatever, but I still identify as a woman? It's like, well, it's still not quite enough, and identifying as non-binary was still not quite enough. And then I found myself like understanding and watching videos like of, trans men getting top surgery and their like top surgery reveals until like 3 a.m. and crying. It would be only every once in a while, but I would like catch myself at night going, searching like, trans guy, gets top surgery or whatever, and I would watch them and I would just sob. And I would have these like visceral experiences anytime I saw people in the trans community. But at the time, it just took me time to understand that what was happening wasn't just deep empathy. It was me trying to say, this is who I am. This is what I need. This is what I want to do for myself,
Mhm.
and this is how I'm going to feel more comfortable. In my body and in my gender expression to make these decisions to medically transition. And even so, along the way, it's like, I think what's beautiful about transness in general and the reason why it's so threatening to um, the the power systems that we are currently under, or most of us are currently under, is that ex- like being willing to be expressive and experimental with your own body, with your own self, to be willing to go to the places in yourself that may scare you, or to ask yourself those questions, to take hormones to start that process, is deeply liberatory. And I think a lot of times purity culture and the ways in which we try to kind of restrict ourselves, I think that we hold ourselves back a lot from being able to yeah, just kind of approach things with less fear and more curiosity. So, I mean, I don't know if that really answers the question.
I'd love to speak a lot more because I found this like fascinating, mind blowing. It's like you're opening a whole world for me that is so different. Um, One, like I just also want to say like thank you for sharing that again, and also because have when you shared that, I had this image of when we met, you performed at Glitch this performance where you show your chest, and I could really feel in that performance that it was not uh well, it was very obvious it was not an act by mistake. It was there's something very powerful in that act of showing your chest and revealing those scars.
Mhm.
um and being myself a performance artist of like, when you perform there's certain symbolic act and you were channeling beautifully with your voice, and there was something extraordinary in your voice when you were performing of like hitting places that the masculine voice brings, but also moments where almost the feminine voice was there. It was extraordinary performance that you offered us. And when you just said, like, you watch those men transition and removing their breasts and having this, you would cry. When I saw your scar, like, I'm like, as a cis woman, I want to say a cis woman, like also super female, I'm like, they're your like thing that you nourish your babies with, like they're sacred, like, and as I'm like, what goes on in the mind of a person that they want to take away those sacred, in my view, these are sacred parts of your body because they're life-giving, they're nourishing, they transmit the life force to the next generation. It's only very recently that we've, sometime you needed to find another woman to nurse your kids if you didn't have enough milk, or it's very recent that we have powder milk. So they were
Mhm.
like this kind of thing. And so in this, I don't really actually consider myself as Puritan, but there is something very, I would say, almost like naturalist in me, like super, you know, nature rooted. And so that brain in me, like, is like, this is a different world. That's why I'm also so
Sure.
fascinated, because a lot of actually my art is about exploring the animal, the nonverbal, and a lot of that. And then there's this, what you're exploring here of like, I remember in this conversation is kind of like, there's a part I feel like, one thing that I think is amazing about what the trans point around identity is opening is not just about, um, it is not just about lesbian or gay right. It touches everybody's identity or conception of reality. And I think that is indeed why it's so triggering.
Yeah.
Because it's not just sexual preferences, it's
No. It's
how
bodily.
you conceive your power to create yourself.
Yes.
Because you're like, oh, we can take hormones. And I'm like, and part of me, I'm like, but so there's an act of creation, but there's also maybe sometime I can think, like, from outside, I'm like, is it also controlling nature, like from the mind, cutting your body to fit what your mind wants? Like, I'm not saying that that's what it is, but there is a part that I'm kind of grappling around, and I'm like,
Yeah.
that's why I'm so happy to talk to you, because
Yeah.
you can give me insight into something I can't have insight.
Well, I mean, and I think when I, appreciate your honesty too around these things, because I think a lot of people feel them. I think a couple of things that came up as you were talking is one, I think it's really difficult for us sometimes to separate ourselves from one another. Like, and I mean in healthy ways, and understanding that each of us are going to experience our bodies and experience our, you know, our lives or our desires to augment ourselves differently. And then secondarily, it's like I'm curious how you feel about tattoos, for instance. Like I have a bunch of tattoos myself, but it's like in those same ways people adorn their bodies or change their bodies permanently. Sometimes not, because now we have things that can, replace things or excuse me, get rid of tattoos and those types of things. But and then also my second thing that kind of came up was like I'm curious how you feel about breast augmentation, how you feel about women choosing to get breast augmentation.
Well, exactly. For me, I see a real parallel between what's going on with trans and like aesthetic surgery. So similar in men or women who are like, oh, I want to change my eyes. And I think they're actually parallel thing. The
Yeah,
way that, and for me it's like a mind. I have
all
zero tattoo. I actually have one accidental tattoo from a performance because my skin was cut and I was working covering myself with Chinese ink. So I
oh
end
god.
up having a tattoo, but it was not voluntarily. So I'm not like, there's nothing like,
Mhm.
partially because I think there's, I don't know, maybe it's pure, but not in the Puritan Christian way, but pure in like in that way of like there's something
And I think if I may, I think one of the things that happens too that has to be considered is the systemic reality that we live in. So I think there's like a deep connection to self, and maybe something to be explored around this idea of if we could strip ourselves back to this sort of natural, to this, you know, whatever that really means, to this sort of like baseline, you know, humanity, would we feel the need to augment ourselves? I think really kind of talks more to, like I said, the structures of society and the ways in which we can't really answer those questions because we're just not in that reality. We're in a reality where we're, you know, at least in
Yeah.
my
And when we met at Glitch, and actually tech and human beings have always been intertwined. And what you said, the augmenting ourselves, human beings have, worn the skin of other animals to augment themselves, their ability. We have worn makeup, we had done tattoos,
yeah,
um, and so is because today technology allow us to be able to have hormonal, biological transitioning the way that was never possible to that extent before. Like
right,
aesthetic surgery gives us means in terms of shaping our body to our, you know, how we feel inside. It should like quote unquote to our desire, means that there it is deeply related to tech. Funny enough, most people think of tech as digital tech, but there's medical tech. The medical tech has
mm,
advanced so deeply that is allowing this, what you call, I did you say transmutation or something like
sure, maybe,
like
yeah,
no you did, but sorry, maybe I read it somewhere else. And so yeah, it's something I'm kind of like grappling with, and I see the power in that. I see the empowerment of like being like, you know what, if I want to, there is a creativity that I think I really want to honor and I sense, but
yes,
and there's also a side that scares me a little bit of like the becoming God in a way of like shape cutting, like cutting ourselves to fit what our idea is versus kind of accepting, loving what we have and how reality is. And it's a difficult balance. And I think that's why this subject is so rich.
sure. Yeah, and I think I kind of come back to that question of like when we start to really go into, well, this is what God gave me or what have you. You know, it, or that there's some type of like I was saying, some type of like kind of baseline humanity that is natural and good and right and should be loved. It's, to me, my my desire to augment my body, to engage in medical transition, was loving my body,
Mm.
is loving myself. It is the deepest love and the biggest sacrifice that I've made for myself because of how, like, it was extreme and continues to be, but definitely when I first was making the decision to medically transition, I knew my life was going to change forever in ways that I was never going to be able to kind of go back on. Um,
Mm.
Being honest with myself and saying, you know what? I can't unfortunately imagine a world, and I'm not existing in a world where I can be in my natural body and feel comfortable. Maybe in a hypothetical, you know, space, maybe that can happen, but that's not the current reality that I live in. And so in this space here, and also with the understanding, like you said, like of creativity, of bodily autonomy, you know, I mean, maybe we have different kind of beliefs of God and sort of like how to respect, you know, nature. But in my mind, we are all our own gods. We are the controllers of our bodies, and we have autonomy over ourselves to make decisions about who we are, how we want to present ourselves to the world. And to me, there's no sin there. There's no wrongness in existing in my body, in this reality, in this time, exactly in a way that feels expressive and expansive and creative for me. Same for you
That's
too.
amazing.
Yeah, I mean, and I think that you are doing that in your own ways as well by your expression of saying, no, for me, what I love is the fact that this is my body and there's nothing changed to it, and I want to just kind of like love that which is beautiful in its
Mm,
own way. You know what I mean? It's just
yes.
it's just a difference in in the ways that we're kind of approaching our being
I think
alive.
the key I think the key is what you said is like, oh, it's coming from love. It's like for you, what you're doing, like like removing your breast is an expression of love. Like for me, the saying I have nothing to change is an expression of love.
Yes.
And I think that's really kind of something really important at the source because from the outside, but it's actually through that conversation that I can then really understand this act. Because from my perspective, this act could almost be seen as not an act of love. But it's
Sure.
for you telling that story that I'm like understanding that that is an act of love. And
Mhm.
and by the way, I also want to say like, well, it's very easy for me to hold these opinions when I'm very happy in my body, and to be frankly, to also be honest, is like, well, I was lucky. It's not even of merit. It's like just genetic pull. It's like I was born decently looking. If I was born really bad looking, well, so what? I wanted to have aesthetic surgery to make myself look better and to feel better. And because how people how you look, people treat yourself differently. There's many studies that shows that. So
Absolutely.
who am I to judge that people want to have aesthetic surgery? Because I happen to be quite lucky that, you know what, I was born in a body that I'm happy in,
Right.
but that's not the case for everyone. But I think it touches deep dimension that is not just indeed about sex. It touches about our vision of the world of self-creation and what that implies, and
Yeah.
actually our relationship to the natural, to the technological. When is it, when do we use it? What does self-creation means?
And to systemic oppression too. I mean, like I think like you were talking about like these beauty standards that people feel it's all well and good to want to, tell people, "Oh, you don't need to, do breast augmentation or get a nose job or to get liposuction or whatever type of cosmetic surgery." But if somebody's experiencing living in a world with a beauty standard that maybe their, quote unquote natural body doesn't, align with, then they're experiencing real suffering on a regular basis to not and to tell them that they can't access those things. Of course, there's conversations around the systemic nature of things and how
Yes.
it's great to, like look at the underlying things and saying, "Oh, hey, there's an issue here with our beauty standards. There's an issue here with this, like, with the ways in which we force women to fit into certain boxes and men as well, but to fit into these certain boxes." Um, it's like, and on the other side of the coin, the other side of the coin is, yeah, but people should also be free to do what they want with their body. And like
Yes.
thing as far as biotech is concerned, as these things are changing, I think it is an incredible gift for me as a trans man, someone who, and we haven't really touched on this yet, but for me, like I guess somewhat touched on it when I was saying, I experienced, um, and have been experiencing life at least for a while, like as a man in a woman's body. It was like I could never take the drag off. It was like I could never
Mm,
looking the way that I didn't want to look, and it was really I can't explain it to a cis person aside from saying, like, imagine tomorrow morning you woke up and you looked like a man, you know, and you were just,
mm,
like, still feeling everything you were feeling, still feeling your connection to femininity, still feeling all of your motherhood, still feeling that, but looking in the mirror and seeing a man's reflection back. Now, you could tell yourself all day long, "I love myself, I love myself, I love myself, I love myself, it's fine for me to live like this," but it's, it's going to feel uncomfortable. A lot of
mm,
ways, it's gonna be untenable for you to be able to live like that and to feel like other people are able to see you, because if people were not able to see me
mm,
people were not able to see me as a man, they couldn't do it. So part of loving myself is aligning myself with a version of masculinity that for me feels authentic, feels real, and feels good. I started taking testosterone and was on testosterone for about 2.5 years and didn't know if I was ever going to get top surgery. I didn't
mm,
know if that was going to be the path for me. But then once I was on testosterone, and this is something that a friend of mine, another trans woman, or not another because I'm not a trans woman, but a trans woman friend of mine said this to me when I first got on testosterone, because I think anytime you're about to get on a new medication, you're starting to think through all these things. And of course, it's a huge decision to make, and isn't something that I took lightly. And many trans people don't, which that's one of the things that I get really frustrated about. And the narratives is just kind of like everybody's out here like getting a new gender like they're getting a tattoo. It's a huge decision that people make. It's life altering. It's not something that people take lightly. But as I was getting ready for that, I was really like leading up to taking the testosterone for the first time. I was really concerned about all these different side effects that I maybe didn't want, that
Mm,
things about myself that I didn't want to change, but were going to be completely out of my control once I started hormonally
mm,
my endocrine system. And so I was really concerned about that. And my friend, like I said, this trans woman was like, what you don't understand yet is that hormone replacement therapy is medicine for people like us. And
mm,
know that until you start taking it. And after one of the first, second doses of testosterone, and I started to feel my body biologically kind of accepting this different hormone, I started to realize that my physical, biological body, my natural body, felt an immense sense of relief, an incredible
wow.
sense of relief. And I felt like you don't know me and who I used to be, but I've gone back even recently because I was an influencer online for a long time. So I have an ungodly amount of footage of myself previously before transitioning. When I go back and watch those things, you can sense that I'm not grounded in myself. You can sense
Mm,
putting on a performance. Um, and the testosterone for me has allowed me to accept myself even more deep, allowed
mm,
a lot more of my personality and my actual sense of self to come out, because what's being reflected back to me in the mirror matches what I feel on the inside. And that is one
mm.
of the greatest gifts that I've ever given to myself, and one of the most wonderful and incredibly liberatory things that gender affirming care offers to people like me.
Thank you so much for sharing your journey. I think a lot of people, um, just it's a real gift of understanding. And like even for me right now, I'm like, wow, like I have no idea because I'm not in your situation, what you go through, what you one had to go through, what it feels like. And it's only by you sharing that I can start having a little peek into what that's like. And also the story behind, the understanding, the thinking behind makes a huge difference. There is also one story that you told me when we met that I thought was very moving, that you said that also when you transition, you also had to go for a lot of grief
Yeah.
for the woman you were.
Yeah.
And could you share a little bit about that?
Sure. Yeah. And I mean, like I said, lots of trans people experience their transness and their attachment or non attachment to the gender that they were assigned at birth. Some people feel absolutely zero attachment to it. That wasn't my experience because I lived for 30 years as a woman in the world before I started transitioning. And I say it like that because everybody responded to me in that way. And I really didn't have any other way of identifying myself or moving in the world. So, even though I've been trans since birth, I've also, experienced a significant amount of time as a woman, and built a lot of my dreams and hopes, I think, around femininity and womanhood, and was obviously instilled with all these things that you and I were kind of talking at length around, birth and motherhood and breastfeeding and all these sort of like feminine things that were a part of the body that I was born into, and something that I felt really deeply attached to. And when I was younger was, you know, intended, or at least thought, like, maybe I'll be a mother someday. Maybe I'll have a child. Maybe this is what I, want to do. I think in many ways I for me, I didn't really have a very strong compulsion. I didn't have like a knowledge that someday I would let's put it this way. I didn't have like a pull to be a mother, like a strong pull to be a mother. But funny enough, I had these dreams when I was like in my 20s of this little boy. I used to have these dreams of this little boy. And so for a while I was like, I think I'm going to have a son. I think I'm going to have a son. I don't know why. I think I'm just going to have a son. And, you know, that kind of faded. And the more that I was expressing and understanding my gender, and understanding my queerness, uh, those sort of like kind of traditional ways of going about building a family or having children just didn't become as important to me. They weren't, in the forefront of my mind. So during the first probably couple of years of my transition, I don't know exactly when it was, but I was in Oregon, living in Portland, Oregon, and I went to the coast there, which is beautiful. And I was standing on the coast and really just taking in the ocean and how much I feel connected to the ocean and always have, and really feel it's such a spiritual, beautiful being entity that exists. Um, and simultaneously, I'd been doing some sort of research into the womb and human evolution, and how the womb is a little ecosystem, it's a small ocean, because we were born
Mm,
in water, and then now
yes.
women carry the ocean in themselves to have, or human beings carry the ocean within themselves to have these babies, which I just was like, what that's so insane. It's so incredible. And at the time I was actually menstruating, and just really dealing with and reconciling with my body was changing. I was on testosterone. I'm feeling this huge hormonal endocrine system shift. I'm also still menstruating. I'm trying to understand my masculinity as a man who has a vagina, who's also having a period at the same time, which can be an extremely dysphoric experience to have, because there's not a lot of paths where you have a lot of men like me who are like, I am a man too, who has a vagina, who experiences this with my uterus and my womb. Like, there's just not any conversation around that. So all that to say, I was standing there on the beach experiencing this grief and really thinking about, like, I'm never going to be a mom, or I'm not going to, I was kind of grieving, um this sort of idea that I had had of myself, of being a mother in the kind of traditional sense, I guess, for lack of a better way to put that. And then I had this realization that I was being a mother, that I was giving birth to myself, and that the son that I had seen was a premonition of the man that I would become, and that the greatest gift in motherhood that I could offer myself was actually laying down and grieving that version of myself to birth into the world this version of myself. And I wrote a piece about that. I know we talked about it, called My Second Mother, where I really formed a, I think, a healthy grief around the loss of femininity as I had it, because it had been, not something that I identified with, like, oh, I was a woman the whole time and then I was a man, but more that the femininity that I had performed was a source of protection. She protected me for years, as a mother would, until it was safe enough for me to come into the world and be myself. And it makes me emotional every time I think about it,
Um,
because of uh, how deep, again, the self-love is to do that, to give myself that. So yeah,
mm,
I still have a deep connection with motherhood and femininity, um, because it feels as if I had a mother that I existed within for 30 years, until it was safe enough for me to come out, until she laid down her life so that I could exist in the world. So she's still with me. She still kind of haunts me in a way, and in the best ways. And I sometimes still see her in my reflection or in sort of a passing window. And instead of looking at myself as, instead of seeing that as like, oh, I have to hide away and not be a woman, or I can't have any sort of connection to my femininity, I embrace that part of myself, and just allow myself to feel the grief, um, of, yeah, of kind of all the things that were tied to having to perform femininity for that long too, and to be unable to be my full self. But then again, like I said, the just the gratitude of that version of myself, for how it protected me and kept me safe until I got access to the things that I really needed to feel. more myself and come out and be in the world as myself, as Uriel.
Thank you so much for this extraordinary share. It's extremely moving. Yes, because I think, for many people know I'm a mother of two, a boy and a girl. And you often use the word femininity and motherhood, and maybe it's different. We use different words and stuff, but for me, when I became a mother and the physicality of giving birth really connected me to mother as a big M, to all mothers. And I would then say also female, because I remember my first pregnancy with my son. One, for example, you can also take period. It's like I think women have a lot of like in their body ingrained actually ritual of like your periods, which is a ritual, a cycle like that comes at a certain rhythm. And like the pregnancy was like that it wasn't like, even if it was I wanted to be pregnant and have a child, even if I, let's say, did not want to be pregnant, I was pregnant, and this body was just going to do what it was going to do, and I didn't have a choice. And I felt very related to female. And for example, after giving birth to my son, I had those kind of breast engorgement, and I felt so connected to funny enough, once I became like gave birth and birthing and bringing connected me so much to the female cows, because I remember where my father lived, there were cows, and sometimes milk cows, and you'd see their breast, like, they really needed milking and so engorged. And I remember when I had my first son, I had that moment where my breast was so engorged, it hurt so bad. And when I gave birth to my daughter, we had a home birth, and I was on the mattress, and in just the last push, she just came out, dropping on the mattress, like, when you see those documentaries of the little horse that just falls down, and that's how she was born. And I felt again very connected to like mama cows and like mama horse, that this like in like very animalistic thing of like just protecting your child, but the cycle. And I had that friend who, when she gave birth, she actually died,
Mm.
and her friend called her back. She heard her child scream, and her midwife said, "Maria, come back." And she came back and she ate her placenta. And because humans are the only mammals that don't eat their placentas, because she was like, that was the only thing to get enough life force for her to live. And
Wow.
I'm sharing this story because it's almost like there's kind of what you're sharing, and there's this world you're opening for me, and like the world I'm kind of almost in. It's like my spiritual journey and my expression journey is to kind of like almost go to the roots, like of like ancient animal, almost like animalistic wisdom. And I feel like some of the thing you're sharing is this kind of like, like the maybe a different wisdom of like using tech as biotech, as creation, as transformation. But I want these two to stay linked, and
Yeah.
that's why I
I
want to talk.
mean,
That's why I've
yeah.
been wanting to talk
Right.
to you in this community for so long, because I'm like, we can't. It's important to not cut the link between. Yeah, I want to say like there's something very raw in like giving life, dying, wisdom of that, of death and birth. And there's also, I think, something that I found as an artist, as a creative, of like, and the kind of creation of life, and also the autonomy, the and creation and autonomy comes together, that I just really wanted to link those two stories of like
Yeah.
you birthing yourself, and this kind of like how we've been birthed by Mother Earth and by that embodiment, that physicality.
Well, yeah, and I mean, I think there's, just from for lack of a better way to put it, from an ecological standpoint, there's all different types of species, and outside of human beings, who, you know, females aren't necessarily the ones who are giving birth. So I think that, and also, trans people in general have existed since the dawn of time. The existence of this sort of in between, or gender nonconforming kind of human experience has been just as natural and just as real as the more binary expressions of gender. And for me, I think that the the thing that I try to kind of expand within myself is that there's there are just different expressions of birth, even motherhood, or this regeneration. I think that it can go beyond gender, and can exist beyond gender. Um, but it also is beautiful to focus in on a certain aspect of it, right? What you were talking
Mm.
about motherhood, and this type of motherhood, and this type of like female, and the cow, and the horse, and feeling really connected in with the energy of creation in that way is beautiful, and a very specific type of birth that the earth experiences, right? That we experience as human beings. It's just a part of what we see and observe, and live out. And then also transness, and this expansiveness of gender, and rebirthing yourself is in and of itself its own regenerative process, um and exists just as it is separate, and that there's specific nuances to each of those experiences, but it is still rebirth. There are still ways that we can, find commonality and common ground in, those experiences. And neither of them, and I think this is the most important thing, and the thing that kind of happens because of patriarchy, those things don't cancel each other out. There's plenty of space
Mm.
on the earth for all of us to exist, and for all of us to relate to birth, rebirth, death, all these things, human experience, bodily autonomy. We can all exist here. We can all have our perspectives. We can all experience our bodies in the ways that we do, and connect in and be inspired by things about ourselves. Um, and there is no scarcity in human experience. We can be fully, your existence in your love of your motherhood, and the ways in which it's deeply impacted your art and your work is is the same but different, as
Yes.
this deeply impacts my work, which I know you
Yes.
understand.
There's so much more I want to talk about your work that I found fascinating. And what you said is like, I also firmly believe that um there is a possibility for a world that works for everyone and no one left
Nice.
behind.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a beautiful dream.
That that a world that works for you and the and but what about also the people who are transphobic? A world that works for mm, like a cis woman and cis men, like that no like that's a fucking mindfuck of a dream
Yeah.
because right now that's not the case. And that's why having those conversation like we're just having is the first step in my view.
Yeah.
And how once you opened all these different perspectives, that's beauty, but then it's also more complexity because there's, you know,
Yeah.
though all these facets, how in that complexity do you still, where is the harmony? There's sometimes where do you still find coherence and harmony? And what I love is you and I had that conversation about ritual design. How in a ritual design would you have maybe cis men, men, trans women, how they would place? Because I think that in the sense of belonging, it's very important that in our society, there's also that sense of like, this is where I belong and I'm safe and this is my contribution. When we don't know where we're placed, like that creates a lot of like
Absolutely.
um,
And I would
uh,
yeah, go
yeah.
ahead.
No, no, go ahead.
If and I would say that, like, to me, um if we had better reciprocity between each other, and if these systems of oppression cease to exist, if these systems of power cease to exist, would we need transphobia anymore? Would it have to be something where we are co-living with transphobia? Because then it extends to
No.
racism and homophobia and all these things. Is yeah, exactly. It's like I don't think that I think that currently, in like I said, in our current system, that we are having to find ways to extend love to people who have been indoctrinated into this belief that they themselves are living in scarcity, because a lot of times we are. A lot of times our experiences are, restricted. And we feel this lack of access, not because that is the way the world works, but because that's the way the systems that control the world work.
Yes, I really see your point. Often like to kind of pull away from like system or an abstraction, but I really see that, for example, in the Western mind, because there's is a Christian fun foundation to the Western ideology. That, for example, in I think in India you have less, in Thai you have less. You don't, you have ladyboys, you have, transgender, like in also South America, that's a lot more accepted. We are like Christianity had homophobia ingrained in it, let alone trans, that therefore gave no room of belonging, and that I think fuels the transphobia that is experienced. I implicitly um and there is seeds of hatred in all human being, and there's seeds of fear, and I think your community experience tremendous is at the front line of receiving a lot of that hatred and fear in this when there's such a paradigmatic change that is currently happening, of moving into one way of conceiving the world to another. And
Mm.
I was particularly moved by your song and the lyrics of your song, um, where you like I think in one of the lyrics you said you call me abominate. Sorry, my English.
Abomination. Yeah.
You call me an abomination. You'd kill me with no hesitation. I was deeply moved by that, and yeah, I'd love to also maybe hear a little bit more about your where these lyrics come from. Is there any story behind? Because what I'm saying is this quite radical of like that we can all live together, you and that like in those lyrics you're referring to people who experience like who are transphobic, and yet we're still both living in the same world. And you also express that you decide to leave the US because you don't feel safe in the US.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I wrote those lyrics, specifically Abomination, is talking about my Christian indoctrination and, um, just the way in which I, you know, was oppressed as a trans person in particular, around understanding that my desire to be myself, my authenticity, my willingness and bravery to say yeah I'm trans, resulted in me being called an abomination. My body and like I said, I've been an influencer online and I actually transitioned publicly online. um, and I have had plenty of people who have come into my DMs who have said, you mutilated your body, you destroyed yourself. I can't believe you would do this to yourself, whatever. Perfect strangers on the internet telling me how I can and can't be living in my body and telling me that I don't know myself, that I don't know what I need, which is really presumptive. And I it's
Mm,
really interesting that we have such a tendency to say that scares me. And so you don't know what you actually feel. That's scaring me. I don't know
mm,
what that is. I don't know how to understand it. And so you are wrong, and I'm gonna tell you you're wrong, and I'm gonna tell you to stop, to shut up, and that you're bad. I'm tell you that you're an abomination, that you don't deserve to live. You don't deserve to live because you are forcing me like a mirror to view myself and to understand that some of the things or maybe some of the ways that I understand myself may not be as cut and dry, may not be as no nuance as I think they are. Maybe there is some nuance to my own experience. So yeah, and I mean for that music video for that song actually, it was really important to me and really special to me, because I went back to my hometown of Nashville, Tennessee, where that was kind of ground zero for all the anti-trans laws that have subsequently just kind of wrecked the whole nation or racked the whole nation. And I went there, and at the time, it was a felony to perform with your shirt off uh, as a trans person, like to be in a public space and to perform. They were kind of tucking it in with like anti-drag laws, right? Because they're so concerned about children being exposed to drag, that they, kind of lumped trans people in. So I went to the Capitol building and I performed with my shirt off on the Capitol steps, saying, you called me an abomination, like you said, but you killed me with no hesitation. And it also, to me, was a way to, again, hold up this mirror to the Christians who I grew up with and say, how can you align yourself with a faith and whose main proponent, Jesus, uh you know talks about loving your neighbor as yourself, and you want me dead, in the same ways in which you vilify the people who crucified Christ. You're grabbing the nails in a cross and hanging me up too. Like, in what way is this helping or furthering this idea of togetherness and goodwill and loving your neighbor to hate me, to condemn me, and specifically to condemn me to death? It's hypocritical and worth, I think, really investigating. And my hope, and you can see in that music video too, I specifically quote scripture, this verse from Matthew, which I'm forgetting the actual verse now, or the numbers of the verse, I will say. But basically, it talks about what you do to the least of these, you do unto me, you know? And so even more so, it's just kind of like, to me, growing up in that sort of environment and then experiencing the hatred from that community, was extremely painful for me, and hence why I wrote Abomination. And the whole video too, you'll see there's like some footage in the background of the video.
Yeah, I've watched it all. It's amazing. I really want to say, like, the courage of doing what you did and singing what you sing, because it brings it so home, like the suffering, the pain, but not just yours, of this community, um and the realness of what you and your community have experienced. And so I really want to express, like, gratitude again in sharing your art, in making your art, in having the boldness, because often the artists are at the frontiers in using art to embody, the change, the and yeah. So yeah, I was very touched. That's why I was like, I'm waiting for the holiday, but then I'm writing to Freak to make sure we're doing the podcast, because, like, your work isn't. I think it's is raw. What I love about it, it's raw, it's authentic, it's no hiding. Um, and it didn't. It's not because you're trans or anything. It is just because this is your access, this is your reality, and what you want to share. And underneath that, there's so much. There's a stand. You take a real stand, and I really want to honor that in all artists and in you.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And yeah, I really value the work that you're doing too, and the things that you are articulating for kind of the ways in which we're relating to each other, and to the mysticism and the renaissance of, I don't know, human experience and technology and all that. It's all, I think, interconnected. Like you were saying, I think that there's more that we can find common ground on, than not. And yeah, I mean, my hope with the way that I'm presenting my own art, or the way that I want to present it, is, like you said, is authentic, is me coming to it and saying, I'm unwilling to wrap my trans experience up in a bow and into something that's easy to digest, so that you can feel more comfortable with my experience of myself. I'm going to be honest about not only what it's like to be me, but also what it's like to experience or what it's like to be trans, but also what it's like to experience the world as a trans person, and what that violence feels like. And I think a lot of times trans people, and really any marginalized, community, is kind of forced to kind of placate whoever, is in the majority to say, "Hey, this is my experience, but let me just kind of softly pat it and let me let me like I said earlier, let me wrap it into a bow to make it easier for you to hold." And I realize that for me, I'm not making art for other people to find me more palatable. I'm actually making art for my community to feel seen and heard. And when I do that, inevitably, people who are outside of the community also feel seen and heard, or at least can connect with, wait a second, something is really, like you said, something is really true here. Something is really honest and really raw. And what about, hopefully, at least this is my hope, is that it will encourage people to say, what's really raw about me? Or like, how can I relate to this, to authenticity being offered to me? How can I also meet that authenticity? And let me tell you, as a performance artist, and I'm sure you have experienced this too, when you start to express your authenticity and you give people permission to be that, it changes people. It absolutely changes people, and it opens people up and can be a real gift. And so for me, my spiritual practice now is to facilitate these performance art experiences and these musical experiences, like you said, with my voice too. That for me, I'm like, if this frequency is going to radiate you out of your status quo and give you an opportunity to see yourself or the world or your position, in the cosmos in a grander way, if it's going to give you more awe towards yourself and towards humanity in general, then that's what it's all about. That's what life is all about, I guess, for me.
Yes. Amazing.
Yeah.
I feel this is a great place to end for today. And I'm saying for today because there's so much more I would love to actually talk with you about,
Yeah,
also on the topic of politics, because you mentioned things about trends and the right wing and the left wing. And there's
right.
um yeah, so much more I want to unpack, like, you know your work around your voice. So I do hope that we'll have a follow up, but I
Please.
also want to be mindful of our audience who've been listening to us. But first I want to say thank you so much for being so authentic, being so honest, and so vulnerable and powerful in sharing, and your groundedness in yourself. And I think I've benefited. I can just speak for myself. I've benefited tremendously in meeting you and having this conversation. I really hope other
Thank
people
you.
will. And for me, this conversation is trying to make sense with others. And
Yeah.
we can't make sense in our bubble by ourselves, staying in our isolated echo chambers. We have to make sense with others, and others that we feel enough of a connection to converse, that but also different enough that it's really enrich our lives. And that's really what I'm walking out tonight, really feeling so deeply enriched by this conversation.
I love hearing that. Well, thank you so much, Sylvie. And it's been such a pleasure to meet you too and to get to know your brain and the way that you think about things. And I appreciate your authenticity as well, because I think that that's the only way that we can have this conversation, is your willingness to show up and be yourself and be, yeah, unafraid and brave to ask the questions and to be willing to sit with me. We talked about this before we started, that it's a two-way street to be open and to be willing to be humble enough to sit with somebody you don't know and to ask the questions that you might be afraid to ask. So thank you for also offering yourself, and your podcast as a way to have this conversation, and hopefully it'll benefit the people who have heard it.
Yes. So stay in tune for Over the Mountains. We'll probably have a follow-up episode with Freak Daddy Uriel. And please follow us.